Welcome, everybody, to the Reflecting on the New York Science Test webinar. I'm really excited to introduce myself. Thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat. So my name is Brendan Finch. Hi, howdy. You can tweet at me at birdbrainfinch or X at me or whatever it is now. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years in Los Angeles. I left the classroom to build rocketlit.com, which we're actually going to get to talk about today. I'm really excited about that. That's an adaptive science reading website, and also Inner Orbit. So we focus on NGSS assessments within Inner Orbit. I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site originally and a lot of the articles on Rocketlit. And now I spend a lot of time figuring out how else we can support students and teachers, either with informal practice around these standards or with additional resources or assessments or reports or other good things. So thank you all so much for being here. And I also just want to say that sourdough pizza is better. I'm not sure if you're aware of sourdough pizza, but it's just better. Anyways, so diving into the webinar, we're going to talk about reflecting on the 2024 New York Science Tests. I want to reflect on and analyze the released test items and dissect what students need to do in order to answer these questions. It's a lot packed into here, and we're going to be moving pretty quickly. My goal is 45 minutes. I'm not sure if we're going to do it. We will probably be here for an hour, but my goal is 45 minutes. So I'm going to try to hold myself to that. First, we're going to do some reflecting on the test. So I have some resources to send out for you on that. We're then going to go over a sense-making paradigm shift, talk about what sense-making is, and then some resources from West Ed and Ed Reports. We love sharing our ideas and editorializing, but we also want to make sure that we're using research and actual things that were produced by other thought leaders within the space, and that we tie those things into the things that we say so that you get to flesh out, just some different perspectives on this, make sense of sense making. It's kind of the goal. We'll talk about using phenomena through a unit too, which is a great way to address some of these sense-making paradigm shift issues. Then we're going to dive into scaffolding up to SCPs. We're going to go through the complexity of some of the released items and talk about how Inner Orbit's items may or may not be able to support you, or at least gives you some frames for how you can approach these items in your own work. And then finally, we're going to talk about reading and science. So one of the things that I keep seeing in the chat right now and that we've heard from administrators is that there is just a lot of reading. And that's, I think, a reality is that scientists spend a lot of their time reading. And that is a thing. So reading is a big part of science, but it's not something that students have been held accountable for prior. So we want to address that. And then I want to introduce you to Rocketlit if you're not familiar with rocketlit.com, and some close reading annotation strategies that we find teachers and students using on Rocketlit to help, give some interaction and some activity, some active reading, so that we're progressing towards and being successful on things like the test later on. And when we approach lengthy readings later on, that we can approach it with I got this. I've been doing this all year long. First off, what is Inner Orbit? I want to define what we are so you understand the way that we see all of this. So in Orbit, we find phenomena, and we pull those phenomena together from things that happen in the real world or research studies, and we ask students to make sense of these new things. We do our best to find discrete and specific examples that are independent from those common examples that we find in curricula, so that students have opportunities to make sense of new things. And that is really important. We're talking about that later on today. Along with those phenomena, we read a bunch of questions. Those questions have really specific element level tagging, so that you're looking at not just what students understand about this phenomena, but what students understand about the SCP element or the cross-cutting concept element or just the DCI element. So we want to make very specific claims about that. And then we want to report those things out to you. So if you haven't seen what Inner Orbit looks like in the reporting end, this is one of our reports that focuses around the SCP. And so we're looking at developing using models, and we're looking at the report on the 3-5 grade level band and the 6-8 grade level band. This is just breaking down very specific things that students have shown proficiency on or are struggling with. So when you see your results from the science test, I guarantee they will not be at this level of detail, which is both a blessing and a curse, because you don't know exactly what students need help with. You just know broadly what categories of SCPs they will need help with. However, you don't know exactly what you need to do to support them. So we want to help you with that process. So reflecting on the 2024 science tests. So I have a little activity for us that we're going to go through real quick. So what were some successes in classroom practice that you experienced in the 2024 science test? So some of y'all said that things were challenging pieces and that I'm curious, you've all been working hard, and I know that that must have shown during the science test. So I'm very, very curious to see, what successes did you see? And then secondarily, what are some areas of growth in classroom practice that you saw with the 24 New York Science Test? So reading skills, stamina, writing claims, a lot of different comments about claims. Stamina, clearly, and then hands-on work and interpreting data are all successes that we saw during that test. So next, we're going to talk about some challenges in instructional materials design. So we are going to go back, we're going to throw it way back to 2021. This is a report from both WestEd and Ed reports that looked at instructional materials. So clearly the assessment represents an assessment of what students have been doing up to that point. And so let's look at some of the designs and some critical features of those instructional materials and some challenges that were highlighted. I think that it's so pertinent because though this was a webinar and a document that was sent out by WestEd in 2021, all of these things are still things that we still see in assessments and instructional materials that are still lacking. If you're a nerd like me and you'd like to dig into that webinar or read through the document, which is very, very long, then please go ahead and click on those links that I just dropped in the chat. So what I want to do in these next couple slides is summarize some of the challenges that we saw for two particular parts, which I think are most relevant to the New York Science tests. And so I'm going to pick apart two things. So we're going to look at phenomena challenges and assessment challenges. And those are two things that as we look at the assessments that teachers are building, and as we look at the instructional materials that teachers are using, I'm going to call out these two things and then give some ways for us to work through these challenges. So first, let's take a look at some common phenomena challenges from Ed Reports and WestEd. And so this is a summary of their information. If you want to dive into their work, you absolutely should click on those links in the chat. To be clear, so Ed Reports and WestEd have different ways that they look at instructional materials. And so I want to specify what that looks like really, really quick. So Ed Reports is a summative assessment. So what they do is they look at an entire curriculum and they say, this whole thing it does meet standards or it does not meet standards. WestEd is a formative assessment. So what WestEd will do is they'll look at a lesson, they'll look at a unit, they'll look at smaller units, and they'll submit feedback to the publishers to make sure that they can improve over time on those things. And so this is detailing the results from hundreds of different data sets or different data points from either in lessons or units or entire curricula that were submitted to these organizations. Some phenomena challenges that they identified are that, so one is the dimensions are often assessed in isolation. And so something that they identified within these, sort of phenomena challenges, that most questions require students to use at least two dimensions together. Ideally, this is what we want them to do. So in bold are the challenges, and below that are what we want students to be doing instead. So most questions must require students to use at least two dimensions together. If you look at the New York Science Test and the released items that we saw, those are all going to be two-dimensional items at the very, very least, or three-dimensional items. And that's what we need to have our students doing. Another challenge that we saw were that there were some single question type assessments. So if you look through your curriculum and you find that there are only one question type, that may be a problem. So we want to incorporate tasks with multiple components. So there's different questions. Maybe we're looking at models. Maybe we're building a model. Maybe we are analyzing data. We're writing a free response question. We're answering multiple choice. We're dragging and dropping. So all of those are different ways that we can assess students' abilities. Varying those question types, like the New York Science Test has both the free response questions and the multiple choice questions, is an awesome way to get better data from students. And that's right. So a third challenge that they found with phenomena specifically are that the phenomena are already explained. So this is something we hit upon in many of our webinars, is that the idea of novel phenomena is really, really important. And what we saw when teachers gave the release test items to students, a lot of students said, you didn't show us this map before, or somebody said in the chat, geography of New York was a challenge that was in the Mentimeter thing. So obviously we want students to be able to look at things they've never seen before and make sense of those things. So really, really important challenge that they noted was that phenomena assessments should be novel from those in instruction. So if you're giving students a phenomena in an assessment, it must be something that is novel from what you went through in instruction. And then the final challenge around phenomena are decreased rigor. So what they found are that there were many assessment targets that were not grade appropriate as they looked through content. And as you're reviewing your assessments, your phenomena, the questions that you associate with this phenomena, make sure that, and in the webinar, they go through this in great detail, make sure that you're asking questions if it's a high school level phenomenon, a high school level assessment, that you're not asking about the third, fifth level. In the performance level descriptions for the New York items, that's what was used to create those items. There are grade level appropriate performances that we're looking for students. So if you are a middle school teacher asking elementary level items or elementary level SCP things from your students, you're going to struggle to get them up to the level they need to be at when they take that intermediate science test. If you're a high school teacher and you're prepping for the bio and the earth space science next year, you need to make sure that the level of rigor on the SCPs, really specifically the SCPs, is at or is at least the middle school or the high school level so that they're ready for those assessment items. So really, really important challenges. They also identified some assessment system challenges, so some assessment challenges, and I'm going to go through those as well. And then we're going to address each of these at different parts of the webinar later on. So some challenges they noted were that assessments had unspecified assessment targets. So like, what are we assessing here? And if you're familiar with the InterWeb platform, this is probably going to resonate with you. So assessments, ideally, and if you've looked at the performance level descriptions for New York, it's the same thing. So assessments target specific aspects of the learning goals at the element level. So that means not just like a standard, but a very discrete bullet point within the DCI, the SCP, or the cross-connect concept. Those are the elements for each of the three dimensions. And these assessment targets are clearly specified. So if we're writing items, and if you're writing items yourself, or you're using another platform that does not very clearly, and where you can validate that this looks correct to you, tell what elements are being assessed, what dimensions of the elements are being assessed, and whether you can see that somewhere, then you should be skeptical of your assessment system. We also want to make sure that there aren't just single opportunities to demonstrate proficiency. So we do see some teachers waiting to assess students for a summative assessment and having one question. So I think an easy one to pick on is OpenSciEd will have a single assessment item. They have many formative assessments throughout the course of their units, but the final proficiency measure is going to be a big free response question where students have to draw a model or write a CER statement or whatever the SCP is that we're assessing. We want to make sure that they have multiple opportunities to demonstrate proficiency. And so that can look like different test items or many different items, or giving them lots of different assessments throughout the course of a unit, which we'll talk about later. One final element that we see, and I didn't write the word challenge because this is a long one, is there are unclear or conflicting assessment system goals and purposes. We talk to teachers all the time who ask us, how do I make these things into grades? And I think that it should be very, very clearly defined as we go through our assessments and our instruction. We should identify some things are intended to generate a grade, and some things are intended to give feedback to students or teachers or district administrators on what needs to be done. And so what are the targets, what instructional activities need to be done, and what are the learning goals? So all of those things need to be clearly connected. So this is an assessment that is formative. This is an assessment that is summative. And so these things are either going into the gradebook or they're not going into the gradebook. They're going into, like our PLC meeting later on to make adjustments. So we want to make sure that we have very, very clear goals in our assessments so we know what we're doing with that data and with that information. All right, awesome. So now I went through all the critical stuff. I'm going to go through some solutions, some options, some resources for each of these things as we move forward to make sure that we have ways to address these different challenges within phenomena and within assessments. And so let's dive into some release test items and talk a little bit more about the sense-making paradigm shift. So previously on tests, students could memorize, details, vocabulary. There may even have been a vocabulary word list that students could use, like flip cards to memorize. No longer is that the case. And so what we're looking for students to do now is make sense of these items. And so the performance expectations, which this is what we're looking at right here, like MS-LS 4.1, allow us an opportunity to, make sense of something novel. So what this performance expectation says is that students need to analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the existence, diversity, extinction, and change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth, under the assumption that natural laws operate today as in the past. There are three different dimensions to this standard, and they look like this. So we're analyzing interpreting data. This is a really, really important piece of this. We're looking at the DCI of common ancestry and diversity and the cross-cutting concept of patterns. So students, in order to answer these questions, they need to use graphs, charts, and images that you can use to identify patterns in data. And so this is the NGSS performance expectation, and this is the New York performance level descriptor for this. So I left out level 4 because we're not looking at those at that level for the test items that they are writing. And I'm going to highlight level 3 here because we want to look at this very specifically. So for the New York State test, students will answer questions, and this is what the item writers use to write their items, where students analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the diversity, extinction, and change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth under the assumption that the natural laws operate today as in the past. So really important when we consider the goals of our assessments and of our instruction, what are we asking students to do in the end? So we want to make sure that they match with either this level 3, which you'll notice is the same as the performance expectation here for the NGSS. And so I think the performance level descriptions, we have another webinar on this where we go over this in great detail that we went over in February. And we talk about these as a good way to, as a litmus test for whether you're meeting the level of rigor that you need or not. And so what I want to do right now is I want to talk about, which assessment is closest to proficiency or sense-making. So sense-making being the measure of the performance expectation and proficiency being this New York State level 3. What I want to do is, so I just took a screenshot of this release test item from the intermediate science test, and I have the performance expectation up here. And I want to give you some options of these 4 different teachers. And all of these teachers are working on a lesson on the diversity of the fossil record. And so teacher 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to have different ways that they're assessing students on the diversity of life and how the fossil record shows that there has been diversity and that life has changed over time. And the image down at the bottom here, this is the exact image pulled from the release test items, is the image that is used in instruction. So the teacher was using this image and talking about the fact that we can use the fossil record to see that different things have existed over time and that they have changed. The fossil record shows changes over time on Earth. And now what I want you to consider is between these 4 teachers, and I'm going to list kind of what they used for assessment, which of these teachers represents or best meets proficiency or sense making. And so you're going to respond in the chat, say teacher number 1 or teacher number 4 or teacher number 2 or teacher number 3, and you're going to say why you think that is representative of proficiency. This is going to be a challenge, and I'm excited to walk you through it. All right. Teacher number 1 says, using the instructional image, so that image that's down there, cite 2 pieces of evidence that living things have changed over time. Teacher number 2 uses that same instructional image, and they say, write a CER statement to explain whether fossil 1 or fossil 2 was alive for longer. Teacher number 3 says, given a new image, so they give a different graph, chart, or visual representation, cite 2 pieces of evidence to show that patterns in the fossil record show that living things have changed. And teacher number 4 says, given a new table of data, so now we're using a table, which is one of the things listed in the cross-cutting concept, draw a diagram to show the differences between when different fossils lived. All right, so I want to give you a couple minutes to think about this. Which of these teachers in their assessment is closest to proficiency or sense-making? And if you want to give a 1-sentence description of why, that would be interesting too. Super fascinating. Okay, so if you are looking at the chat and you're seeing that people answered different teachers, you probably understand why we're doing this activity right now. Because I think that this is not crystal clear. All of these are rigorous things. Writing a CER statement, citing evidence, drawing a new diagram, all of these things are rigorous practices. And I think what's interesting about them is only one of them is making sense or explaining how or why to answer the performance expectation. And that's why we're doing this. And so let's dive into our analysis of this to talk about which assessment is closest to proficiency. And drum roll, please. All right, so teacher 3 is our vote. And if you look into the chat, there are a couple of justifications in there, which I think are really, really important. So the new image is very, very important here. All of those teachers were engaging in rigorous tasks, but they aren't sense making. And so this is tough. They won't prepare students for the test because what students are going to see on that new test are novel phenomena. They're going to see new phenomena. on the state test that have not been covered in instruction. And I know for a fact that the writers are working very hard to find different phenomena than what you find in typical curricula that are out. What's great is that you can see all these curricula and we can see all the phenomena in there. So the writers can be like, I'm going to write something different than is in the Open Scied Life Science, or different than what's in the Amplify curriculum. And so that novel phenomena is really, really important. There's also explicit use of the cross-cutting concept, the DCI, and the SCP. So we see they're using that data. That data is coming from a chart. They have to analyze that data. So they have to pull evidence from that. And they have to use that in order to explain common ancestry and diversity, it's fantastic. And so this is actually the exact question from that, or from the released test items. And so in the chat, I'm a little curious about this one thing. So just to push this a little bit farther, because I think this is a question that is outstanding. So could the teacher have used a multiple choice question so that the prompts that we gave were all free response questions? And I originally, when designing these slides, I put in some multiple choice questions in there, but I think it'd be fair because I thought there'd be some bias on there. Do you think that the teacher could have used a multiple choice question to gauge proficiency, and why or why not? So I think you could probably ask pretty smart multiple choice questions here saying, these 4 different students gave you an analysis, and you could read through, you could have like student A, student B, student C, student D, and give different analyses. And they would have to choose that. And that can be pretty tricky. Or 2 pieces of evidence and their justification for that. And so Glenn says proficiency would be level 3. Multiple choice could be used, but it isn't as good as hearing from the student's thoughts. Yeah. So you could give a multiple choice question for this. And so I want to give my opinion here. It would require a lot of extended responses for the items. And I don't think the data would be as good as getting students to write that in there. Yep. And so Emily nailed exactly what I was saying, various interpretations of the data, and that students chose like different patterns that they cited. So I agree that I think it is possible to write multiple choice questions that could assess proficiency for this, but it's really, really, really important that we make sure that we're not just doing rigorous things, but we're making sure that rigor is connected to sense making. And so one of the challenges that was cited in the West Ed and Ed reports data was that there was decreased rigor in what we're asking students to do. It's important to note that rigor is not just the activity that students are doing, but the degree of sense making that they're undergoing. And by giving them new images, new phenomena, novel data sets, so novel representations of the same ideas, you're giving them the level of rigor that they need. And so all of those questions that you're going to see on the New York State test are not going to involve data sets that students have seen before. Students need to be used to seeing novel things. And so I want to present you with some ideas for how we can ensure that students are able to do this and see these new things. So these are slides that you've seen before. If you've been to other webinars of ours, I'm going to go through them really, really quickly just to walk you through a different standard and ways that you could use that standard to give students lots of examples of phenomena throughout the course of a unit. So this is MS LS42, and we're going to look at different phenomena that are on the InOrbit website for this. You can find phenomena in other places as well. This is just our source of information. So students have to apply scientific ideas to construct an explanation for the anatomical similarities and differences among modern organisms and between modern and fossil organisms to infer evolutionary relationships. So this is another phenomenon, one of these standards where there are so many different examples of ways where we can find fossils that show relationships. And so I want to present to you some ways where students can be constructing explanations, talking about common ancestry and diversity, and using that cross-cutting concept of patterns. And so what we're going to talk about here are where not only during an assessment, but during instruction, we can insert additional phenomena to give students other ways to see that phenomena come to life. And we have this roadmap that we've been building, and we presented this before, but what I want to show you is that during the course of a single unit, we can give students multiple different phenomena. And this is just for a single standard. So most of your units probably cover many different standards. And so one of the things that we can do is at the beginning of the unit, we can give students like a whole class walkthrough and discussion. So why do whales have hip bones? We could just show a picture of a whale and their hip bones and say, why? Like, they're not dancing. Why do whales have hip bones? It doesn't make much sense. And then we can ask a second question later on. So we can go through our instructional units and continue on. And then we can give another example. So why are bird and bat wings so different? And so in this phenomena, we look at bird wings, we look at bat wings, we look at the differences and similarities. And I think what's important here is it's the opposite of the evolutionary relationship that we're seeing, with the mammals and with whale bones, because birds and bats are not the same. And it's an example of, like these two things evolved the same features, but through different pathways. That's super duper interesting. And we can use this as something. So in Orbit, you can save items and you can print out a PDF of those items and give those to students. So we see some teachers printing out a phenomena and a couple of items that are two-dimensional or three-dimensional, and then giving them to groups of students to work together. And maybe as a teacher, I can kind of model the process of sense making and looking at the different images, the data sets, the models, and give some scaffolding. And then finally, at the end of the unit, we could use a separate phenomena, again, for just one standard. Why do some cavefish have eyes while others don't? And we can look at these two different cavefish and compare why these things did evolve with eyes or did not, and infer relationships. And so again, we want to make sure that we're addressing this challenge that phenomena are already explained. So please, please don't assess students on the same phenomena that you used in your instruction. If you're doing that, then you're greeting the challenge head on and welcoming it into your practice. And instead, we want to give students additional phenomena to look at that are not instructional phenomena and that are not explained. You can scaffold the explanation for those phenomena. Strongly recommend that you model the process of sense making, but don't tell students why things are happening before you give them assessment on that. That is really, really important. We also want to feature, so a lot of our students and teachers are struggling with sense making on grade level. Obviously, that is end of course requirement that students are making sense of phenomena on grade level, but you can also walk back from that middle school performance expectation to the third grade PE that precedes it. And we can use 3LS41. And this standard says analyze and interpret data from fossils to provide evidence of the organisms and environments in which they lived long ago. So environments have changed over time. That's super interesting. So we can take a look at, how can extinct giants teach us about ancient Earth? Or why are all these whales in the deserts? These fossils of whales that are found in the desert. That's weird. So all of these are just examples of how we can give students additional phenomena to, again, give more practice looking at phenomena they've never seen before and trying to make sense of those phenomena. You can ask them for response questions. I think I'm gonna pull together a pattern for the free response items that are on the New York State test in the slides that follow this. But if you just ask any questions about these phenomena, noticings and wonderings, how does this relate to what we just talked about in class, that those are going to give you a huge bonus in students not losing it when they see phenomena that they aren't familiar with. And that is, I think, the easiest hurdle for us to overcome, but you need to have access to phenomena to do that. So on an orbit, we find many different phenomena. Our goal is 5 to 6 phenomena per performance expectation. So in your units, you could have 15 to 20 different phenomena that you're giving students through different activities and different assessments, or just do nows. It could be simple things. They don't have to be full-blown assessments, just to give more practice at looking at novel phenomena that you have not explained to them. You can explain it afterwards, but you want to give them opportunities to make sense of those novel phenomena. All right, I think I've rang that bell quite enough. Now let's talk about scaffolding up to SCP complexity. So one of the things that I saw written into the chat, and one of the things I saw as successes from classroom practice in the Mentimeter, were that there were some complex questions and students did a great job interpreting data, backing up claims with evidence, supporting claims was something that was written in there a lot. And I think it's important for us to analyze these items and figure out what we can do to support students in making progress on this. So here's one of the release test items in case you have not seen these. If you've looked at these a lot, I'm sorry, but we're going to go through it one more time. So this model below shows, this is from the intermediate science test release items, just to be clear. The model below shows or represents the bones, the arms of an extinct dinosaur called the Velociraptor. And then we also have models of bat, human, bird, and dolphins. And the question that is asked of students is, and there are a couple questions, but here's one of them. Identify the organism alive today that is most closely related to the Velociraptor. Use evidence from the models to support your choice. So students have to write down the organism and they have to cite evidence for those things. So in the chat, I'd love you to reflect on, so what are some smaller steps that students need to take to answer this question? I think what I see here too is that they're looking at models, they're comparing different model types, and then they're using those comparisons to notice patterns and cite those patterns as evidence. So comparing model types, noticing patterns, citing those patterns as evidence are 3 things that I see. Yeah, comparing, as Daryl said, exactly. On the 5th grade test, there's this kind of like famous cluster on the beavers, the beaver populations. There's lots of Lots of things on here. Students need to use evidence from the map and graphs, which claim accurately describes that in a particular habitat, beavers sometimes survive well, less well, or cannot survive at all. And then there's a separate question that asks, one graph shows the number of beaver families, the other graph shows the number of beavers. Using evidence from the graphs, describe how both beaver populations changed over the same time span, regardless of their location in the United States. And so this is another example of these two things where students are now, I want to call this out one more time. There's a claim that's identified. They're comparing data between two things. And then they're using the comparisons, the patterns they notice, to cite evidence within the answer to the question. Cool. Here's an additional New York test item, same thing. So students are comparing early stage embryos between humans, rabbits, chickens, turtles, and fish, and then later stage embryos, which in some cases look nothing like the initial embryo. And then we want to provide two pieces of evidence to support the claim that the chicken is more closely related to the rabbit than is the fish. So again, students are identifying claim, they're noticing patterns, and they're using those patterns to cite evidence within the released items. And so I think there's a really simple 3-step process here that we can go through with our students. And the reality is that most of these SCPs have much more complicated things that they're asking students to do in a performance expectation. In the release test items, however, students really are doing this really simple and replicable process, which is they're looking at patterns. They're looking at a claim, they're noticing patterns in models or in data sets, and they're citing those patterns very explicitly as evidence. So pretty simple scaffolding that we can go through. And so this is addressing the challenge. So we see this all the time, is that a single question type. So asking those multiple choice questions, asking those free response questions is important. But what we see happening all the time is we'll see teachers just asking free response questions or just asking multiple choice questions. Yeah. And so just to address one of the questions in the chat, which is a great question, Daryl. So am I correct in thinking that a student doesn't really need to know about the actual organisms as opposed to how to compare objects? So it's really, really interesting. I think that for each of these answers, that there are some students that, they may just need to compare those objects, just comparing data sets. So this question specifically says provide two pieces of evidence to support the claim that the chicken is more closely related to the rabbit than it is to the fish. So I would say, in order for you to understand that, you would have to understand that the early stage, there's the relationship between early stage, middle stage, and late stage embryos, and how we can infer evolutionary relationships from those stages in those embryos. It may be possible for students to answer the questions without that, but if I didn't know that that's what I was looking at here, I may say that, I may cite things from the early stage embryos rather than the late stage embryos because I don't understand how that's indicative of the evolutionary relationship. And so I think that's really, really important here that, students have to understand the DCI 100%, but they have to use that DCI knowledge to analyze data and to compare different models for that. So I would say for this question, you would need to understand that evolutionary relationship broadly. It doesn't matter if you understand humans, rabbits, chickens, and turtles and fish, but if you just understand the idea that there are evolutionary relationships and early embryos look similar and late embryos look different, if that's all you understand, then I think it's pretty simple for students to answer these questions. Yeah, Emily. So I think the first part are understanding a claim, noticing patterns, and using those patterns to cite evidence. And those are 3 things that we see. Cool. And there's a question in the chat that asked about reading research and phenomena-based design. So some of these questions, you'll notice this one right here has very, very little text. It's really just literacy in reference to an image or a model. And so I think some of the questions, and we'll go over one in just a minute, are much more reading heavy questions. And some of the questions are really, really, really just like, I need to read data sets and models. And those are both different types of literacy, so important to call that out. All right, great. I want to make sure that we move on a little bit more. Oh, thank you, Glenn, for putting the performance expectation in there. That is fantastic. So for the New York test items, what's really, really important is that you're going to see multiple choice and free response questions in almost equal proportion, which is amazing. So it's amazing because students get to see, this is excellent assessment design. Students get to write their thoughts out. And so you're going to have a lot more a lot more practice with free response questions than we see in other state tests, which they're simple questions. And I think this is a major pro to how the test is designed. So multiple choice items need to be rigor enough to match that PLD level 2 or 3. And we see those FRQs very much in the format of, so cite 2 pieces of evidence that support XYZ claim. So really important, we need to make sure that students are focusing around those novel and specific phenomena in order to access those high-level things. That means oftentimes what I think is read the question first. So understand the claims that are being made, go back to the phenomena to notice those patterns. And then what I recommend, and what we found to be successful in accessing in orbits phenomena, is practice underlining, circling, identifying evidence. You can have students write that down. And that process of just like what 2 pieces of evidence validate this claim, you could use any phenomena you wanted. And you could write that up on the board. What 2 pieces of evidence, support this claim? And you could show them an image, a graph, a data set, a table, a model, anything like that. Those questions, these are like quick and easy questions for you to ask students. You could ask it verbally or have them write it down in an assessment. So I want to show you a little bit of what in orbit looks like around this, because it's pretty helpful. And we're going to go, I just want to be honest with y'all, we're going to go a little bit over. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. But I want to walk through just how we could use InOrbit to do these things. And so if you go to the InOrbit website, you can click into one of the phenomena, and you're going to go down and you could use this phenomena, and they're very simple phenomena. And you can just say, what's 1 piece of evidence that energy can be converted, or 2 pieces of evidence that energy can be converted from one format to another, or from one type to another. And we can just ask them questions about this. This is all about solar energy. Super cool phenomena. Asking these multiple choice questions, getting drag and drop questions, getting multiple choice questions, and asking free response questions where, again, students are explaining their reasoning are really important. We need students to be able to answer multiple different types of questions in order to be successful in these tests. And that's really important. We also, so if you're not familiar with InOrbit, just to clarify this, so we are very specific about our claims for questions. So some claims will be tied to just the DCI. Some questions will be claimed to tie to just the DCI. Some questions will be tied to the cross-cutting concept and the DCI. So a very discrete piece of the standards. And some will be tied to the SCP and the DCI. We just want to be really specific about what claims, what targets our assessments have. So when we look at data later on, you can use those things. And so you can pull questions from InOrbit, you can show the phenomena up on the board, you can ask those, cite 2 pieces of evidence to support this claim. And I think it's a great way to just give students access to all of that. All right, great. So I'm going to go real quickly through this. So InOrbit can help you to support with unspecified assessment targets, single opportunities to demonstrate proficiency. If you give them lots of different ways to look at phenomena and to answer questions, then they have lots of different opportunities with the cross-cutting concepts, the SCPs, or all 3 together to show proficiency, and making sure that your assessment system goals and purposes are clear. And so you can say these assessments are formative, these assessments are grades. And that's really important to very clearly specify the purposes of your assessments. We also have these things called SCP practice problems, which are interesting. They are single-dimensional problems focused on SCPs using non-content related phenomena. And so students are able to go in there, teachers can assign assessments to focus on SCPs and build skill mastery. And so if you don't want to burn instructional or content heavy phenomena, you want to use other phenomena about, like, I don't know, building a hammock or different mousetrap cars or something like that, you can use that as another way for us to support students in building up that SCP practice. Cool. And now I want to talk a little bit about reading supports really quick and dive into some options for this. I'm gonna move through this pretty quickly, so bear with me. And thank you all very much for sticking with it. There was one question in the chat that came up. So the science of reading speaks to the need for background knowledge to read and be literate with both words and data sets and graphs, which is why I'm asking. Yeah. So this is a question to the hosts and panelists. I just want to make sure everyone hears it. So what we see in all of these different questions is that there are opportunities for students to understand models and data sets and to be able to read text. So they need to be able to look at images and interpret those things. And then separately, they need to be able to read, and this is what we're about to get into with our next section. They need to be able to read text and pull data from text. That's really important. So this is, one of the phenomena from the 5th grade science test released items, the elementary released items, and it focuses around this North American beaver. And the first couple questions it's just a whole bunch of text and there are questions that follow. There are no, I mean, this image is a supporting image, and there are some questions that ask about that image. However, a lot of the meat in this phenomena is in this text, so students have to read independently. So I want to present to you our other website, which is intended to help with this very specific thing. And so if you don't know what Rocketlit is, so Rocketlit is a leveled reading website that I designed for my classroom. We have reading that ranges from grade levels 3 through 12 for the same topic. So articles are written at 7 different reading levels. And then we give you reports on where your students' reading levels are at. So there's a reading diagnostic that students go through. And as they read through things, we identify vocabulary words and reading articles that they need to work on. As students read articles, we move them up in a reading level over time. So you begin at a level that our diagnostic sets your students at. And then over time, we move them up or bring them down articles depending on their score on our reading comprehension. So Rocketlit is really, really simple. We'll head over to the articles tab just to look at it really quick. And so if there is an article on different kinds of plants, we're going to have that same article written at a 3rd, 4th grade level that can be read aloud to students, at a 7th grade level, with much more complex language, or at 11th, 12th grade level. So the idea is students have access to independent reading no matter what grade level they're at, and they have access independently to science knowledge and vocabulary no matter what reading level they're at. And those two things are very difficult to have together at once. So all of our articles are written in the same way. There's super fun images and pictures, and then we have articles written at 7 different levels. So the idea is that students are consistently reading independently within the zone of proximal development, and that we're moving them up or down based on their comprehension within those articles. So there's a quiz that follows those articles. It's really focused on reading comprehension. All right, great. We do see teachers using close reading strategies in Rocketlit. So the annotation purpose can be looking at the main ideas. We can use a fix-up strategy, or students can write questions. Rocketlit has some annotation tools that you can use where you can highlight, you can underline, you can circle, you can write notes next to those things. So I want to walk you through this really, really quick on Rocketlit because it's not something that we've highlighted before in our webinars. And we have this whole other website that's really cool. So Bouncing Light Off the Moon is one of our articles that focuses on reflection, phases of the moon, solar eclipses, and the word generate, to talk about light and where light is coming from. That the moon does not generate light. Super interesting. So some close reading strategies that we see teachers doing with Rocketlit articles. You could do this within Orbit as well, but we don't have the annotation feature on there yet. So we can write down things like, I need to reread this. This was confusing to me. And so maybe at the end of the article, they can make a note for rereading this and circle those words. We can say, this is the main idea. So highlighting some text within the article and saying, this is the most important thing here. We will probably have to answer questions about this later. Or saying questions. So, why can't we see all of the moon? And students can write those questions in there and annotate the articles. So what we strongly recommend, and what close reading strategies offer, are very discrete things where a circle is something I go back to, a highlight is a main idea or a relevant detail, and then underlining is maybe something that I have a question about. So I would strongly recommend, as you go through your readings with students, that you offer them opportunities to interact actively with the text, so they are actively reading. For the New York Science test, I also strongly recommend that students go to the questions first, and they go back to the phenomena later on to make sure that they are reading with a purpose. That's really, really helpful. Otherwise, I think students kind of like blast past all of that. Cool. And you know what? That's it, y'all. Thank you so much for being with me. I know I went a little bit over, but I really, really appreciate you hanging out. I hope you have some chocolate handy and you can give yourself a little break. And like Russell here, enjoy that. And Kevin doesn't steal it from you. But thank you all so much for being here. I am grateful for y'all. If you would like to meet up with us and try and Orbit out on your own, you can use that link that Julia just dropped in the chat. Please do so. You can sign up for a trial account or follow us on social. We post videos like this on YouTube all the time, and we would love for your thoughts on this. So if you have any questions, I'm going to hang out for a couple minutes, but I'm really grateful for those of you who stuck around for the entire time. This is a long webinar, and you are awesome. So I hope this was helpful, and you can always email us at inquiries@inorbit.com too if you have questions. But otherwise, I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day, and I'll hang out and answer questions, but I'm going to turn off the recording. Thanks, y'all. Take care.